month review for The Deep by Nick Cutter. I was really curious about this book because he is a Canadian author. I always want to read more of them. But this is also a book my dad had read, and I wanted to read it as well, given that typically he and I have a lot of similar tastes when it comes to horror. What I failed to realize at the time was he's less bothered by kind of like weird body horror, and I'm more affected by it than I thought. To give you a brief intro of the book itself, it is a horror book set in a research station in the deep sea in the Pacific. As I mentioned before, this is by a Canadian author, and I will give you a warning now for both body horror, parental abuse, and mental health. Those are all three things that I kind of picked up on with my read-through of the book. To summarize the book itself, within this research station in the deep sea, there is the potential for a cure for this epidemic that is ongoing on the surface. And the main character you follow, Luke, is going down to this research station because, of all things, his estranged brother has asked for him. In some capacity, nobody knows why, but because of the potential for the cure, the people running the show bring Luke in to visit his brother. And with that, I'm going to break down the plot into the pacing and the story progression, and now that you have a summary of what happens. And since I mentioned it was horror, as you can probably guess, it goes a little wrong. So the pacing itself I found was really effective for a horror book. There was the constant tension building. Some things would release a little bit of steam, so to speak, allowing the pressure valve of the tension to lower a little bit, but then it would climb right back up. I really appreciated that the pacing really enabled this by constantly having that building sensation. And on top of it, the pacing was consistent throughout the book. That's another reason why I feel it was so effective in holding up the tension building over the course of the story. And additionally, for me at least, the pacing really helped with maintaining my engagement with the story. Because there were constantly weird things going on, I wanted to keep reading to figure out what was happening, and you were getting enough resolution as you went that it didn't feel like you were building up to nothing every time something new and intriguing and creepy happened. How I worded it here, that I should have just read it, is that the pacing consistently allowed for the integration of new tension and new situations to the story. I don't know why I didn't just say it that way. I'm just rambling. It's okay. And with that, I'm kind of done talking about the pacing. I'm going to jump to the progression. And while the pacing was very quick, very engaging, I actually found the story progression to be not quick or engaging. Because of how the story progressed, you were constantly wading through obstacles to get the story to move forward. And for me, that ended up making the actual story progression feel very slow, despite the really consistent tension building. And to me, these are almost two separate things, because the tension affected the tone and the mood of the story, but not necessarily the story itself. And the obstacles took two forms. They were mental obstacles, either like hallucinations or out-of-body experiences or nightmares, and it resulted in an unreliable point of view, a sense of unreality, which, while I enjoy, they really hindered the storytelling in this case. And then you have your physical obstacles. This is the research station itself, the goo they're researching, and like just general physical injury. And these were a lot harder for me to read. Some of them you could just, yep, this happened, move forward. But regardless of physical or mental, you really just were constantly wading through obstacles. And it got to the point where I just wanted one or two things to just happen, because I wanted the story to progress instead of having what was going on and going to what will happen having 6 obstacles, I wanted just like 2 obstacles. That would have been enough. But it ended up being a little convoluted because of that. And in terms of the story, I did appreciate the direction it took. I thought the story was building up in a very specific way. So while I was having issues with how slow it was happening because of the obstacles, I did enjoy the direction the story took. The only downside for me is that once the story reached its climax, once it got to its peak, I felt like the payoff wasn't quite there. And given how the rest of the story had built up, I was just a little disappointed. That's really all there is to say. So to summarize that, good pacing with good to build tension. The pacing was consistent. Story progression, while interesting, just didn't quite hit the spot for me because I felt like it was progressing too slowly despite the pacing supporting the tension. And with that, I will go to characters. I'm just going to talk briefly about them and then go to like pros and cons of the book overall. Because of the main character, you were following his perspective, I found the kind of unreliable narrator role to be really effective in the story. And I love how it ended up making the character, like the side characters, a lot more interesting. And I say this because I feel like the characters involved, the side characters specifically, were a little cardboard cutout-like. And while they weren't necessarily spectacularly flat, I recognize that a lot of the depth that you see is just because of Luke and the fact that you're stuck in his head and you are looking at his interpretation of events, and he's just going, because of the situation and the sense of unreality, just so many things are going on that he's just reading into things way more deeply than you need to, or he needs to with the situation. It was just, I really enjoyed the way that point of view built up the other characters as well as the narrative. And I also, within the point of view, really like the way that Luke is telling the story, because you are getting what's actually happening, but also you're getting his opinion, which is kind of filtering the context. But I liked that he was still describing what was happening accurately. It was just his interpretation of events that was like a little bonkers. And throughout the story, this really was intriguing for me because I ended up questioning Luke and like what was going on and what his motivation was, and what was actually going on, despite having others having similar experiences. It was just, that part of the story was really intriguing, and I think that Nick Cutter did a really good job with the unreliable narrator without giving Luke one of those like stereotypical like alcoholism, drug addiction, like something like that. Like, it really did seem to be more of a situational unreality rather than a personal unreality. I'm sorry if I come off a little frustrated in this clip. I forgot to record on my mic, and then for whatever reason my camera cut out halfway through filming, so not only did I not get the audio for the clip, I didn't get all of the video, and I'm just irritated. So I just finished up with the characters in the last clip. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of this book for me. For me, it had a really awesome tone and setting. I liked that it was isolated, I liked that it was creepy, and I liked that it maintained both of those things throughout the entire story. My second positive was the pacing in terms of tension. I really liked that the pacing built and maintained the tension by constantly integrating new sources of tension into the setting and new situations into the setting that would lead down new avenues that would, again, increase the tension. It was very nice, kind of like self-fulfilling story use of the story. However, I did have a couple negatives as well, which you may already have guessed based on what I said previously. So for me, the actual story progression was a bit of a negative, largely because I didn't enjoy the way that the obstacles came up so frequently, And it felt like every time I turned around, there was something else going on that was preventing the story from moving forward. So even though I liked the way the pacing built tension, I don't think it did the same thing for the story, which is unfortunate. My second negative is the body horror aspect. In my previous clip, I talk about it for way too long. I'm going to try not to do it again. But the body horror I had issues with only so far as, like, the supernatural body horror. I am not someone who's necessarily disturbed by a lot of blood and gore, like torture, amputations. Like, I might flinch at a description if it's particularly apt, but as a general rule, blood and guts doesn't really bug me. However, the body horror here did. And I think a lot of it is because so much of it was left up to the imagination, so to speak. The goo doesn't change a person the same way cutting off their arm does. It's a lot more insidious. And there's something about how weird it was that just didn't vibe with me. And I really think that it almost felt a little too supernatural because you don't really know the origins of the goo, the effect the goo's gonna have, or even necessarily what it does. You just know it does things, and I think it was like the kind of lack of logic, kind of fantastical element that bugged me so much. I'm gonna stop there instead of rambling about it until the recording shuts off, which is what I did last time. So from here I'm gonna jump into my wrap-up. I did give this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. There was lots to enjoy here. I really enjoyed the bones of the story. I really enjoyed the way the tension built. I enjoyed the way the pacing supported the tension, and I liked the isolated setting. I also liked the sense of unreality for Luke and how his point of view really impacted the story overall, and just helped, again, support that really creepy tone that was amplified by the setting it was in. However, the surreal body horror just didn't do it for me. In fact, really pulled me out of the story, as did a lot of the obstacles, both mental and physical. Yeah, so even though this book did have a lot for me to enjoy, I feel like the execution just wasn't what I would have liked out of a book. I think a lot of people do like this, and I can see why. It just didn't do it for me. And so with that, I'm just gonna leave it there and move on to my book club questions. So the first question that I always do is, what is your initial reaction to the book? My initial reaction was both intrigue and confusion, because it introduces the Gets to you, which is a weird disease that manifests in, like, brain degradation similar to Alzheimer's, but in the general population. I got really intrigued by the disease because I didn't realize it was that big of a part of the story, and then, like, 3 chapters in, I realized it's not part of the story, and I got confused because they give you more than what I would consider situational context for why the research station is there, and then I ended up just being disappointed because I thought the disease was really intriguing and it just ended up not being touched on again. Question 2, what is your favorite chapter or scene? For me, it was when Luke finally kind of challenged his brother. He unloaded quite a bit on him, but he also needed to unload a little bit on him, and despite not necessarily agreeing with every decision Luke made, I definitely was super pumped to see him challenge his brother and stand up to his brother like that, and just, it was such an anchoring moment in the story. It gave you a very grounded sensation, and it addressed so many things and so many issues I had with Luke's brother that I just cheered Luke on while it was happening. Question 3, how did the characters change throughout the story? Well, they all changed, and they all changed for the bad. They all got this sense of unreality and the really disturbed sense of reality that resulted in basically, like, them all going crazy and or dying. So, I mean, they changed, just not for the good. Question 4, how did you like the ending? This is a question I always think is really important to ask, because there's so many books where I feel like it's a 5-star book right up until you get to that final scene. This isn't necessarily one of them. I was mostly enjoying the book, but I was hoping that the ending could save it for me and make it like one of my best reads of the year. But the ending, for me at least, was about the same as the rest of the book. And just the way it ended, I felt a little out of left field. It didn't feel like as consistent with the rest of the story as I would have liked, but that could just be me taking different things from the story than was necessarily intended. Everybody reads the book differently, and I can see a lot of people really enjoying the ending. I just wasn't crazy about it. Question 5, would you read more by this author? This one is a hard one for me because I liked enough parts of the book that I would definitely try to pick one up again, but my only caveat would be like, only do normal body horror. Like, if it's just people dying because of axe murderers or like torture or like other physical sharp object cutty stuff, I could probably do it. But if it's horror more like kind of what was going on with the goo and when people were being transformed by the goo, I don't know that I could do that. And then finally, we get to my 6th question, and that is, what other books does this book remind you of? This book actually reminds me of a book I haven't read in years, like since late high school, I think. So, decade and a half now. Anyways, and that book is The Tommyknockers by Stephen King. The reason that it feels similar to me is, like, the general story vibes are the same, but the situation is very similar, somewhat isolated, and then you have somebody else coming into the situation, and then both party members, like, devolving because of their exposure to the situation. There's kind of surreal, supernatural, kind of body horror in both situations. In the deep, it's the goo. In the Tommyknockers, there's like an aliens involved. And it's just like the deconstruction of these people's humanity because of situational stuff and just like weird like going-ons. Just in general, overall, vibed very similarly for me between these two books. That being said, I haven't read the Tommyknockers in a really long time, so I don't know how close it actually is, but to me, based on my recollection of the Tommyknockers, they're pretty similar. And that calls it for today. I'm doing my best not to ramble or be too short with the camera because I am very frustrated with that last clip and how it didn't work out. But, I'm done. I got to tell you about a book I mostly enjoyed, and I had to come back and film another 15 seconds because it cut me off again because I rambled too much. Comment below with any horror suggestions that you have for me. Like I said, I did really enjoy the bones of the story here, but it was a supernatural body horror I didn't care for, so if you have any suggestions that kind of fit that, like, please leave them below. I would love to get them from you. Or if you have some comments about something I missed in the book or something you particularly liked about the book that you want to discuss with me, leave that down there too. It's probably one of the best places to interact with me in regards to anything in the video. And with that, I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.